now streaming on the YouTubes.
Are we
Hey
on the
everybody,
YouTubes?
we're gonna get started
Hello,
in
YouTube.
a few minutes. Welcome to our chill, happy, fun time.
Do you think that this makes us tubers if we're like on YouTube right now?
Yes, we are.
I don't want
No.
to be part of
What
that.
about Ubers? What are
Tubular. We're
YouTube
totally tubular.
tubulars? We are totally tubular.
Oh,
Oh my God.
very much flashing back to when I was a teen and my parents were like, "Are you on the tweeter? Is that what you're doing?"
The tweeter. Are you on the tweeter?
I am on the Twitter, Mom. You can't stop me. I'm on the tubes.
Oh goodness.
Coffee is your friend.
Yep.
I just got these
drinking some of
cool
my
space
kombucha.
bird stickers. I'm going to give you one later, Charlie.
Oh, you're so nice. Thank you.
Aren't those
oh my God, that's
amazing?
beautiful.
This
I love
artist
it. It's so
made
beautiful.
them. Yeah.
It's so beautiful. I love it.
They're so sparkly. Okay. That was just our little introductory.
All right.
Okay, wait, does that mean we should start, Dave? Or does the embeds are up mean that we should get started? Or okay, great. So Annalee.
Yay. All right. Welcome to Our Opinions Are Correct, a podcast about the meaning of science fiction and its relationship to society. I'm Annalee Newitz. I'm a science journalist who writes science fiction.
I'm Charlie Jane Anders. I'm a science fiction writer who thinks a lot about science.
And today we're going to talk about portal fantasies, the history of them, why we love them, why we briefly hated them. And joining us to talk about all of this is Naman Telehan, author of the Wrath and Athenaeum series, which starts with the amazing novel The Root, which you should all go out and buy. And thank you so much for coming, Naman. The second novel's out too, right?
Yeah, the second novel, The Tree, is out, and the third should be out next year.
Yes. Okay, everyone click buy right now.
Woo!
All right. So before the show starts, we always make a little musical noise. So the show's about to start.
Do, 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 do.
All right. So let's start by just talking about what a portal fantasy is. This is kind of a long-standing fantasy genre. Charlie Jane, do you want to give us a quick overview?
Yeah, so basically a portal fantasy, as its name suggests, is about a doorway. It's basically about you go through a portal or an opening or a door or a wardrobe or whatever, and you find yourself in another world, a world of adventure. And usually there's often like mystical destiny or quests or things as well. And sometimes the person who goes to the portal is chosen. And it's basically like someone from our world, from the ordinary world, goes through a portal and finds themselves in a fantastical, magical world. And it's different from urban fantasy like Supernatural or arguably Harry Potter, or
Although
epic
Harry
fantasy
Potter
like
might...
Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, because people come from our world and go to the fantasy world. Harry Potter is kind of an edge case.
Yeah, what do you think, Naman? Do you think Harry Potter is a...
Yeah, I think if you define portal fantasies a little more loosely, instead of going from one world to another, as going to a new reality or a new perspective, then things like Harry Potter sort of fit in there. But it is like it's where two genres merge, really.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Totally.
It does have a bit of urban fantasy to it in a way.
Yeah. I think it's harder and harder to separate genres nowadays.
Yeah,
That's
it's
so
really
true.
And I mean, when we were talking about this before the show, I was saying to Charlie that portal fantasies really go back quite a long way to sort of medieval fairy tales about going to fairyland and like being stolen away from your bed at night, taken to another world, and then there's consequences in the real world for what happens. And I think that's a big part of portal fantasies, is like some of them deal with the consequences and some of them don't.
Yeah.
But then also, I think for our purposes today, mostly what we're talking about are the more modern portal fantasies that kind of start with Alice in Wonderland. Going down a long, wet hole. Or Chronicles of Narnia, where you go into the closet in order to become gay, which is very exciting. Naman, do you have any thoughts on like where portal fantasies begin for you? Like when you look back on kind of like greatest hits of portal fantasies?
I mean, so I think there are three big Portal fantasies that are like the big three, and it's Alice in Wonderland, it's Peter Pan,
Oh
Right.
yeah,
Of course.
and a little
totally.
differently, it's Wizard of Oz, because Wizard of Oz is sort of exclusively American, and it's more of a visual medium than a book series. People
Hmm.
are more familiar with the film than they are with the book series.
Yeah. Although the book
That's
series was
so
hugely
true.
popular, like
It's
it
super
was,
popular, but it's
yeah,
also
at the
And there
very
were
time.
like plays and other filmed versions, and it was huge.
well, and the book series actually has a lot of interesting queerness and gender stuff in it that doesn't translate into many of the adaptations of it.
That's
But yeah,
true.
I think those are the big three for me that are like the beginning of Portal Fantasy as we know it, and
Yeah.
also
Yeah,
the
I
reason
didn't
of
even.
some of the chains on us for like people want to go home sort of ideas.
Oh right, yeah, because Wizard of Oz is all about wanting to go home, and yeah,
Yeah, it's such a weird, it's so funny that in Wizard of Oz, the quest is to go home. Like I made it through the portal accidentally in this case, and then now all I want to do is go home. Whereas, modern portal fantasies like Every Hearted Doorway by Shauna McGuire, it's basically please get me back to the fucking portal. Like that's all
right,
that the characters want is like they get there and they're like, this is an awesome place. And then they leave and all they just spend all their time trying to get back.
Yeah.
There's no place like the portal, basically.
right. So we actually have a clip from Alice in Wonderland that I'm going to try to share with you all in real time. So
Yeah.
fingers crossed. This is from the Disney Alice in Wonderland. I'm super excited, and this is her going through the portal. Um,
Ooh.
Oh, such a good one.
Well, we don't have sound, but I think we all get what's going on. This is great. It really is. God, I haven't watched this in ages, but it really is the long, dark, slimy hole. Oh, and the kitty doesn't get to go.
I mean, I forgot the cat even existed, really.
I
I
like
did
the
too. I
cat
forgot the
waving
cat
goodbye,
being like, bye bye. This is how
and
you
then
know you're. Oh, and her
and then
skirt like breaks
her
her
skirt
fall.
turns into a parachute. I love that her skirt turns into a parachute. It's so
I need to
great. I
get you a
love
dress
it.
like that, Charlie.
Yes, I need a parachute skirt. I need an Alice in Wonderland dress super bad.
Okay, so Naman, why do you like Portal Fantasies? Tell us what's good about Portal Fantasies.
I mean, speaking for myself and personally, like
Yeah.
I love the idea of going to another world. Like just being like a queer brown kid, I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. And that's also why I was so angry at Portal Fantasies. My mother showed me The Wizard of Oz when I was really young, and I was just so angry at her wanting to go home. I was so enraged because I was like, go back to the Dust Bowl. I was like, if I got swept into a mystical world where people are like, you might be the chosen one, I'd be like, oh cool, I'm here. I'm never even gonna find that.
Yeah. Where you get to
Yeah,
have like a
totally.
cyborg friend and a lion friend. It's like,
Right?
fuck Earth.
Why am I going home? Also, I'm an orphan. That woman's trying to take my dog. I don't need any of this mess.
Yeah.
So
What
I just think for me, the idea of going to another land, which was more open and more full of possibilities, was something I loved.
what about you, Charlie Jane?
I mean, the thing I love about Portal Fantasies is kind of the sense of, I don't know, irony, detachment, because what makes like a Portal Fantasy for me is that you come from our world, you come from present day, whatever, 20th, 21st century Earth, and then you find yourself in this colorful fantasy magical land, but you still bring all your Earth stuff with you, and you still have all your kind of knowledge of Earth pop culture and like tropes and like it's not like you were grown up in Westeros and you just all you know is Westeros culture. You know this whole other frame of reference that is what the reader is also bringing to it. So you're kind of like a bridge between the reader or the audience and the rest of the world, which I think is really cool. And I think that that's part of why people sometimes don't like Portal Fantasies is that level of detachment. It's not like you're a native to the place. You didn't grow up. I mean, there are characters who grew up there, but the main character usually isn't a native. And so I really love that. I think that that makes it way more interesting and way more fun. How about you, Annalie? Why do you love Portal Fantasies?
So I can say, I mean, I love different portal fantasies for different reasons, but I wanted to say one thing that I think is super interesting about portal fantasies, and this is what was making me think about the queer theorist Eve Sedgwick's book Between Men, which was a 1990s classic of queer theory, where Sedgwick was basically just talking about Victorian novels where two men are obviously fucking, but they can't be. And so one of them has a girlfriend. Yay. Oh, I love that cover. Yes.
Oh my God.
Alman is holding up the cover for those of you who can't see what's going on. Awesome. And so what Sedgwick says is the way that these novels kind of work out having a queer story without having it is they have what's called a heterosexual alibi, which is basically just one of them has a girlfriend or a wife or something like that. Hopefully she's dead, you know, so that she's kind of not really in the way. Or she's just off screen all the time. And I feel like the secondary world that you pop into through the portal is kind of like that heterosexual alibi. It's an alibi because you're allowed to do whatever the hell you want because it's a fantasy world. So say you go into the fantasy world and you do something naughty, like you break the law, you commit a crime, you engage in sex that you wouldn't normally, or other kinds of stuff. But it's like, it's okay. It's the portal alibi, you know? And then when you go back to the real world, maybe there's consequences or maybe not. Maybe it's just like, well, back here now, I'm me, I have my regular life. And so I think it's really fun when reading or watching a portal fantasy to see how they work that out. Like, what is it an alibi for? What does it allow you to do? And sort of see what the consequences are, if any. So that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, are portal fantasies basically inherently queer?
Yeah.
Yes. Definitely.
Yes, moving on.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, I'm just going to say, you
Say
go
it.
through a closet door in the case of Narnia. You literally go through the closet door and you emerge into a colorful, sparkly world where everything is just like, woo! And there's like people in the Wizard of Oz, there's like witches wearing like basically like frou-frou dresses and like waving wands around and saying like, you know, I'm going to give you ruby slippers. It's so, I don't know. Nama, what do you think?
I agree. It's very queer. I think it also sort of ties into what you were saying, Charlie Jane, about the difference between second world fantasy and portal fantasy, about being a native or not. And sort of, do you feel like a native of the culture you're in right now? And do you feel a part of the society you're a part of? And being queer in America, you sort of don't in many ways. And so I feel like the portal fantasy is sort of an allegory for that in some ways, of going to another space that might be more accepting.
Yeah, basically you walk through the door of, you know, the queer space and it's kind of a portal fantasy. It's like, oh, now I'm in a club where everybody's dancing with whoever they want and whatever gender presentation they want.
Yeah. All these things that the quote unquote real world told me were wrong or didn't exist are here laid out in front of me.
Yeah. I wonder if the portal alibi thing is a part of fantasies where people ultimately feel more comfortable in the real world and they kind of use the portal to go to like let off steam, but they really just want to get back to the real world. Whereas the queer portal fantasy is where you want to stay in the inside the portal, you know, and it's like the real world is horrible. So
I think that
I
So
also
if you're not,
oh, go ahead.
if you're not fully out yet, it's like, oh yeah, I spent the weekend in the magical world, and then I came back to my wife and kids, and like, oh, that was a business trip I just took, and yeah, oh no, I didn't stay there, I just visited. Oh yeah, oh yeah, no,
What happens in the
totally.
portal stays in the portal.
Like the book by Catherine Valente, Palimpsest, feels sort of inherently queer in their groping to get back there, and the sexuality of all of that book. I thought that was really an underrated.
I love Palimpsest. I feel like we could talk about that forever, but I mean, first of all, it's about a sexually transmitted portal, which is amazing. Like, because you can only get into this beautiful dream world by having sex with someone who's been there. And then once you've done that, you get a tattoo of a map on your body, which is one part of this city. And like, if people can get together, they can like visit each other's maps. And it's like, yeah, it's such an incredible novel. Very, very queer.
Yeah.
Again, like Every Heart a Doorway, where it's everyone kind of has their own world that they go to, and what the characters have in common is that they've all been to these other worlds that are very accepting of all kinds of sexuality. All right, well, let's take a little break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about why portal fantasies weren't cool and then they became cool again. Break music. This is how it always is in the studio.
I love it.
Yep, that's our break music. It's
all right.
Super high tech.
All right, Charlie, you ask the questions now.
Okay, so I remember like 10, 12 years ago hearing a lot of people say that portal fantasies were over. We're done with them. We don't want them anymore. And, why was that? Why do you guys think that there was like this kind of backlash against portal fantasies? Naman, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I think part of it was the idea that portal fantasies were all about trying to get back to the real world.
Right.
And also, okay, so my little quick theory on that, misogyny. Because when we talk about the big three and we're talking about Alice, Peter Pan, and Dorothy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All three are young girl characters written by men.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And all three of them are sort of written at a time where women didn't have as many options.
Mm-hmm.
And so this sort of prevailing propaganda of even when women are offered a fantasy world, what they're going to want is to come back to the Dust Bowl of Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
Because they home heart is where you are. So I think there's this weird linkage in there, which is messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that people had a really narrow idea of what portal fantasy could be. And that happens with every subgenre. Like people had a really narrow idea of second world fantasy for a long time and what it could be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like
that makes sense. Yeah.
The hatred, or not hatred, but I feel like the kind of rejection of the portal fantasy came roughly around the time that people were really selling a lot of urban fantasy and like supernatural romance, urban fantasy books and movies and TV. So I feel like I think Naman is completely right that there was like this view that portal fantasies were very limited, that they had to kind of be a particular type of story arc. And so the only way we could break out of that was to bring the fantasy into the real world. But even when you brought them into the real world, like one of the many tropes in urban fantasy is that there's a secret underworld of magic.
Yeah.
So it's never like, well, sometimes it is fully integrated. Like sometimes you get like a superhero story where like everybody knows about superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
But
there's definitely everybody knows about magic in some urban fantasies, but yeah.
Sometimes it's pretty rare. I mean, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a really interesting example of a novel where everybody kind of knows about magic, but they just don't think it works anymore.
Also, the series by Kim Harrison, her In the Hollow series, is set sort of like 20 years after a genetic virus wiped out a bunch of humanity and all the supernaturals came out on Halloween. Because they knew no one would believe them, so it'd give them a buffer of time to set stuff up before like started to panic.
So interesting.
That series.
That's really cool.
About, like,
so everyone knows about the supernaturals then.
Yeah, everyone knows there's a special police force for them. Hilariously enough, tomatoes carried the disease that wiped out people. So now only supernaturals eat anything with tomatoes because everyone else is afraid of them.
No more pizza. Oh man.
Yeah. Oh man. Well,
pasta.
At last, the New World punished the people who came and stole all their crops. God damn it.
But I mean, I think that part of the portal fantasy backlash does have to do with that sense of like, the kind of the irony or the whatever of like people who are not from the supernatural world or not from the magical world. And part of what people like, I think if you've read a million fantasy novels and you're used to all the tropes, you don't want to follow a character who doesn't already know everything. You want to follow a character who already knows the entire world inside and out and they're just like, yep, I was born in this world, I am a native, I understand it completely, because that's the perspective of people who are like really serious diehard fantasy readers. Whereas I think
Hmm.
Portal fantasies originally were kind of catering to people who hadn't read a lot of fantasy books and did
Tourists.
want to follow people who were, yeah, who were visiting from the regular world, and like could relate to that kind of like, oh, this is all new to me kind of thing. So I think it was, I think in general, what's happened in genre publishing in general is that people, like, you have a, books are now very much geared towards people who just read tons and tons of fantasy and science fiction and know everything already, and are going to be like 201 or 301 level, you know, readers rather than 101 kind of, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, also, I think that with stuff like urban fantasy, where you are kind of often plunged into the world from the perspective of someone who's from like the magical underbelly or the magical, you know, subway station or whatever, however they formulate it. Um, I think that that also allows you to tell, I mean, it allows you to tell things like detective stories or romances, which have their own tropes that are really familiar. So, like, there's certain ways that the story is familiar, even if you're not like a diehard fantasy fan. Like, if you just know, okay, how do detective stories work? Oftentimes, the detective protagonist in those stories is kind of from like a marginal place, you know, like, and so they're not, you know, they're not from high society or like, you know, someone who lives in a suburb. They're like, they live in a gritty apartment and, you know, drink a lot or whatever. I don't know. I've only ever watched Jessica Jones. I don't know how detectives work.
That, those are all very true.
um, well, so why did they come back? I mean, why did Portal Fantasy
Yeah.
come back? That's what I want to know. Naman, you tell us why.
Okay, so I think that what happened is, well, we started to get into a lot more meta narratives in fiction, a lot more boundary crossing fiction, and people started to see new ways to tell portal fantasy stories. I mean, you were just talking about like Charlie Jane, about someone being at like a 301 level and knowing the and wanting to
Mm-hmm.
have that, and then people were like, well, why don't I? No, sorry, why don't I write a portal fantasy where someone is a fantasy buff and then gets sucked into
Right.
the world and knows the tropes and is like, sweet Jesus. Um, I read a book. Oh, I wish I could remember the name, the title and name. I'll tweet it out when I remember. Where it's a university that's connected by all these portals to different lands, where they like
Ooh.
thesis students go and pretend to be dark lords to keep the energy going, to keep the cycle going. And it's like one
Oh my
guy,
God.
this is my thesis. I was the dark lord on this planet. And then he gets sucked back in, and all the heroes are like drunken messes 20 years later. And he has to pretend to be the hero against the Dark Lord now. So like there was a lot of interesting stuff happening. I think you also saw it with recent cartoons like Star versus the Forces of Evil, which sort of flipped the
Oh.
narrative and had the magical princess shuttled off to Earth because they were like, your magic's too dangerous to be here right now. Go to Earth and train. And so she's sort of the narrative person in a reverse portal fantasy.
Huh.
And
Oh,
yeah,
right, because Earth is her secondary world, basically.
yeah, but it also goes back and forth. So it's a very sort of meta new genre bending place to go with this kind of worlds.
Do you think it's a new idea that we would go back and forth between the other world and our world? Because I feel like the three big ones that we talked about, like Oz and Alice, it's all like it's one trip. You know, like you go, you work really hard to come back, and that's it. You're done.
And that's what's interesting, because when we talk about Alice, the show that I remember more than anyone is, well, number one, the movie with Carol Channing as the White Queen, which is tonight.
Oh yeah.
So good. It's like 4 hours or something. So great. But other than that, Disney had basically a live action TV series that was Alice, and every episode was her going back to Wonderland and like hanging with her friends and then going back to the real world.
Oh,
So
wow.
they basically made this TV
Really?
series where, yeah, where the
When was
doorway was just
that?
open. Oh, I don't know. I saw the reruns on Disney. I want to say it
Oh
was,
my God.
Okay.
but it was like every episode was her going back to Wonderland and then coming back to her real world. And
Huh.
I think with Wizard of Oz, I personally have a very big love for Return to Oz. which is the
Yeah.
Oh,
Fruza Balk movie where she, like, Dorothy is in a mental institute and is desperate to go back to Oz. And I was like, if you haven't seen it, it's great.
I
It's like,
love Fariza Balk so
oh,
much.
it's
I
Like,
her,
have
like,
not seen that.
we
oh,
need to watch that. Like, I stand her forever because of The Craft, but
I
lots of
mean,
other things
great
too.
film.
Yeah.
But it's about her escaping a mental institute because she kept talking about Oz and being desperate to go back and ending up back in this new Oz with, like, new friends and new enemies.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah,
So
and that's the kind of inflection point, right? Like the sort of the
Yeah,
90s and the aughts are when we're starting to see a turn back toward portal fantasies, like the
yeah,
I
reinvention of
think
the
it's
portal
really the
fantasy.
last 10 years or so. I don't know. I mean, I was going to bring up a few things. We talked about Every
Yeah,
Heart a Doorway.
yeah. Great
And
series.
there's also, and Every Heart a Doorway has that level of irony. It has that level of like, we're
for
older
sure.
now when we want to go back. We want to go back to the magical world. And we're also kind of a little bit more fucked up and jaded. And we're kind of just, and it's more explicitly queer.
Mhm.
And similarly, The Magicians, the book series, but also especially the TV series, really kind of comments on the portal fantasy and the idea of going back and forth. And actually, hey, we've got a clip from the Magicians TV show, which I guess I
Here it
found out the
is.
hard way. I can't show you. I can't have audio, so this is going to be annoying. But I'm going to just show a little bit of this.
You should just narrate
This
it.
is okay. I'm going to just narrate the clip. So this is Quentin. He follows a piece of paper into an alley, and then he goes through, and it suddenly gets all magical, and there's trees, and he says, "It's here our story begins, a land of magic."
And
And
hot
that's
boys.
and very hot boys. Oh my god, look how hot!
I love
That's like
his
season
vest.
one.
I
Oh
guess I
my god, he
watched
looked so
it. I
hot in
never watched
season.
it. I'll admit.
Uh
You know,
it's
it the
it's
first.
it's a bumpy
It's
ride.
really fun. It's
I wasn't a
it's
huge fan of
really
the book
fun.
series, so I was like, I guess I shouldn't watch them. But maybe I'll check out the first season.
I think, I mean, honestly, the TV series is, it takes it in a different direction,
Okay.
like, and Sarah Gamble, who was the showrunner,
Well, I
is
love
amazing. Yeah.
much of her work. Yes.
Yeah. So she
Yeah,
takes it
she's
in the right
amazing.
Okay.
direction, and the characters are adorable. Like they're just, yeah, it's definitely,
Elliot is amazing.
yeah.
It's worth it just for Elliot.
And
So I
everybody's
mean,
humping everybody, and it's anyway.
I'll prefer my
Annalee's way of
pancakes
rating a
anyway.
show is everyone humping everybody. Well, gets an extra point for that.
so the thing that y'all mentioned about portal fantasies where you can go back and forth and it's not so much like you go on a trip and then you come
Mhm.
home. It made me think about Doctor Who because Doctor Who to me is like a big portal fantasy. The TARDIS is literally like the wardrobe from Narnia, except it's
Mhm.
cooler because it leads to all these different fantasy worlds.
Yeah.
And in the original Doctor Who series from like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, somebody from Earth gets in the TARDIS and they're off on like a long voyage and they can't go home because the TARDIS can never find their way home again. And so they're just traveling. And finally they get home. And I guess in the 70s, there was a little bit more going back and forth. But in the new series in 2005, the thing that they changed was the going back and forth was much smoother and the companions have family and they have friends back home and they check in with their family and friends every
They
time they
have
go
a
home.
special mobile device that they can use to
They can
call home.
they can phone
They
home.
can stay in
Their phone
touch.
actually works. Yeah,
Yeah.
they can phone home and it's not so much of like you're on this journey and you can't possibly reconnect with your home. It's just like, nope, we're going, oh yeah, I'm gonna go home, hang out with my mom, and then I'm gonna go back on another trip.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I wonder if, as we think about like the rejuvenation of portal fantasies, to return to that question of like who's a native of what land, I feel like these are definitely fantasies about sexuality and going in and out of the closet, but also about immigration and who gets to come through, because who, like, a lot of these are one-way portals. It's like, oh well, we get to go there, but like it's not like all the fucking bunnies and wacky mad hatters and shit come here, right? Like that doesn't really
Well,
happen.
I was gonna an interesting TV show that sort of addressed that badly, but is still entertaining and ran for like 15 whatever. Stargate.
Yeah.
Stargate series, which they literally go through a portal. There are a bunch of native people on the other side, some more
Mhm.
advanced than them, some less advanced. And a lot of it is negotiating who wants them dead, who wants them alive. They're not great about race all the time or most of the time. But I mean, when the only black member of your team is a former alien slave, you're sort of like, okay, we know what we're getting into here.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in that show in terms of colonialism and an interesting framing of, in the beginning at least, Egypt as a colonizer, because all the aliens use Egyptian mythology in the beginning, and later in the series it expands. But it sort of is this weird reversal of colonialism.
Yeah. What about that long-running TV series where all of the fairy tale characters are like living in Maine or something?
Yeah. Once Upon a Time.
Once Upon a Time, yeah. Although I guess that's different because that's more like, that's not a portal. It's more just like a secret underground of fairy tale characters.
Sort of it. No, it is a portal because they get sucked from their own land. It's sort of like, what's that? Bill Willingham, the Fable series.
Fables, right? And there is kind of a trend of like using magical creatures to talk about immigration more like explicitly in like a lot of these like shows, and like Grimm is the same way, that TV show.
Yes.
What happens in Grimm?
Actually, Grimm is about like a police officer in Portland whose aunt, who's dying of cancer, comes to visit him and tells him that he's a Grimm, which means he has he's super strong and fast and all that, but also he can see these inhuman things called the Vessin that hide among us. And a lot of them are based on sort of Grimm fairy tales. So like one of the main groups are the Blutboten, which kind of turn into wolf-like creatures. And many of them go crazy when they see the color red and attack it no matter what.
That's handy.
It also becomes about alliances within the community, and the community like wanting purism because like two different Wesson marry each other, and the rest of the community tries to come after them and kill them. Like, so they do weave in other stuff. I watched that whole series during quarantine very recently.
Yeah, I've actually heard only good things about it. So yeah,
the last couple seasons, and there's a whole sex assault by magic that sort of gets ignored, where I'm like, that's a problem.
Yeah, that happens a lot, actually. Yeah. I feel like that's part of the portal alibi, is a little bit like, oh, well, like, shit happened, but like it didn't mean anything because it was magic. And it's like, yeah.
Well, and also in the reverse direction, the comic book, I Hate Fairyland. I don't know if you guys have read that.
No.
Tell us more.
A girl who gets sucked into Fairyland and has to go on this quest to solve it, but she's unable to do it and is there for 40 years stuck in the same little girl body.
Wow.
Being angry, trying to get laid at certain points, and people are like, you're a child, and she's like, I'm 40 fucking years old. I hate everything.
Oh no.
And I just want to go home. And meanwhile, other kids come through and like find their way home in like 5 minutes, and she's just like, I hate everyone. And she turns super violent and starts killing people. But it's an interesting take on like bitterness and anger and resentment.
Man,
that is
I want to read
cool.
that.
I was just thinking as that another interesting twist on the portal fantasy now is the show Upload, which is about a guy whose brain is uploaded into a virtual world. And we see a lot in that show about class and how your experience of the virtual world depends on how much money you have. And he's in this really fucked up position where his rich girlfriend, who he was about to break up with, has paid for his upload. And so anytime he wants to get anything in the virtual world, like she has to pay for it. Like, even if it's just like he wants to get a, it's anything, like if you want to upgrade your avatar or you want to eat a donut or whatever, it's like as he walks through the world, like money pops up. And eventually we find out that if you spend all your money, there's these rooms that they send you to that have nothing in them, and you just power down and you just sit there for like years and years until someone pays for you to be animated again. And so, but you can never get out. So it's like a one-way trip, and they keep trying to figure out technology to re-upload people back into bodies, and they can't. But it's kind of, and also of course people can watch you. So it's voyeuristic, like people in the real world can watch you in the virtual world and you can't do anything about it. So it's like the panopticon portal thing. But it's interesting because it does allow you to have these really obvious class allegories. So yeah.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to ask Naman about his portal fantasies. So, Naman, as you know, I love the Wrath and Athenaeum series so much, and I'm so
Yeah.
excited
So
that the third
good.
book is coming out next year. It's so freaking good. And part of what I love about it is that it's a version of the Portal Fantasy that I've never seen before, partly because it kind of takes the Portal Fantasy and mashes it up with a little bit of urban fantasy and a little bit of like, kind of Game of Thronesy secondary world fantasy. Can you tell us more about that? Like, how did you approach the Portal Fantasy, and what made you decide to include that aspect in the books?
Well, it's actually interesting because it started as two separate books. Um,
Oh.
it started as sort of basically the two worlds as two separate stories that I was doing. And I'd started both of them, and just something wasn't clicking on like one. Second world wasn't working, urban fantasy wasn't working, but I was still liking the stories. And I realized that the mythos was close enough that if I twisted them together, it could be something different. And it just grew from
Wow.
there. Like it became really interesting once I did that.
Yeah, because it's like I've never seen that before where you have
Oh,
like the one character in our world who like creatures are coming through and he's having to fight them and he finds out that there's this other world that he has to go to. But then we switch and then we're in that other world and there's someone who's like a native of that other world who's dealing with a whole other set of problems. Like that was just such a cool approach. And like, you know, do you feel like Portal Fantasy gets more interesting when you mash it up with other stuff? Do you feel like it kind of gets a new lease on life when you add other elements to it?
I think adding other elements can add layers to it that weren't there before. Especially when you're talking about like one of the things we were talking about is the allegory for immigration and stuff like that. And when you have POVs on both sides in both worlds, it becomes a more nuanced view of like what that means for people to cross over and what it means for like a world to suddenly have this influx of creatures that they never knew existed or creatures that they have historical records about but view as lesser beings. So how do these people begin to work together and deal with that? I think it's most fantasy when you add like an element of almost real world um, POVs, you get more detailed ideas and more nuanced ideas, like the Laurie J. Marks series about colonialism, stuff like that. When you look at it from a different point of view, it becomes something much more interesting.
Yeah, and so I mean, did you get any, pushback or did people feel like you're doing Portal Fantasy wrong or did you?
Um, I got a little bit of, I mean, I didn't get pushback. I think I got a little bit of pushback because there were so many queer characters in it.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
where it was like it just doesn't make sense for all of them to be queer, and I was like, queer people hang out with other queers. I don't know what to tell you. Like, we have a lot of queer people in our circle of friends. That's what happens. So it makes more sense. But mostly that was the pushback I got. I think I was lucky that when the editor picked up my book, it was someone I had known for years. And it was
Mhm.
someone who knew my politics really well, knew that I'm a loudmouth really well, like someone who knew that like what I was basically going to write was going to be very queer and very like POC focused. And they were down with that.
And did you feel like this was a chance to kind of, you talked about like with immigration kind of literalizing a little bit of the metaphor that was always there. Do you feel like it was a chance to kind of bring the queerness that was already in Portal Fantasy kind of a little bit more to the fore and kind of show how it is a metaphor for queerness or it is about like the queer experience?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that especially the character Eric, the character I have in our world, being openly queer and Black is already something that's affected his life in a very intense way when we join him. And so going through the portal, and not even going through the portal, but learning about this other world sort of gives him this whole new lease on life that was taken from him. And this new option of like, oh, I can do this. This is part of me too. Um, which I think is really important. Like I said, I think like portal fantasies are inherently queer. I think all fantasy and sci-fi is inherently queer just a little bit. But I'm like, that's me.
I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I'm like, it's all just a little bit queer. It's all just like a queering of the quote unquote real world. And like this opening of all these different options. Like even if Star Trek, like when you talk about Star Trek or Doctor Who and stuff like that, Doctor Who recently has gotten a lot of queerness, which I appreciate. But even before that, just having all these worlds that they maybe didn't fully explore left possibilities for people to like write novels and audio plays and fan fiction and write that queerness into the fabric of it.
Yeah, I do think that the idea that there's another world out there where like everything is sort of turned upside down, you know, like, and all the rules are different, is really, yeah, it is really queer. It's like, it's saying that like, all right, anything's possible, you know, and, you know, nobody's going to come and bust up your bar for dressing in drag or whatever. So what do you guys wish that Portal Fantasies would do differently going forward? Like, where do you want to see this subgenre go?
I mean, I really like the direction it's going now. I really like some of the ideas that are being examined in Portal Fantasy. There's that recent show, The Infinity Train, about a young girl, and it's very like Snowpiercer. Young girl trying to run away from home, ends up on a train, and each car is very different. Like one car is a Grecian world with talking corgis who rule it, and another, and then another car is like
my two favorite things: Greece and talking corgis.
And like the king is like, I'm the one who brought the Pembrokes and the regular corgis together in peace. Like it's a very, but I think that people are pushing the idea of what Portal Fantasy can be. And that's important for it to stay relevant. You can't just like let it sit on its laurels. And you see that with the reimaginings of older Portal Fantasies, the reimaginings of Peter Pan, the reimaginings of Alice in Wonderland. Like a lot of people didn't like those weird sci-fi miniseries they did, like Tin Man and stuff, but I was like, I'm here for it. It's very weird.
Oh my God, I forgot about those.
I was like,
I did not forget. They were interesting. I mean, they were trying.
The Alice in Wonderland one was like gambling houses and stuff, and I was like, okay, I don't know what's happening, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, just fuck shit up.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. I think I'd like to see more humor. I mean, obviously, I like humor. I like funny, weird, silly stuff. I think Portal Fantasies, there's always something, there's kind of, I mean, you think about Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland, they're inherently really campy. They're super campy. It's often like just the other world that you go to is a little bit of a pantomime or whatever. It's a little bit like, woohoo, we're all wearing our like silly outfits and dancing around, and there's lots of dancing. And you know, it's just like very goofy and silly. And, you know, there is that layer of irony that I mentioned of like somebody who's kind of been in the real world and kind of seen all this weird shit in the real world, then going to like this more like often the world inside a portal is like more innocent in a weird way, which I think can lead to some interesting irony. So I feel like I'd love to see more done with that, more done with just like the humor and the silly and the campiness of it.
So you want kind of more The Wiz?
I guess. I mean, I don't. Is The Wiz campy? I guess it is. I mean, is The Wiz more campy than The Wizard of Oz?
Wow, that's a good question. I feel like Wizard of Oz
is more campy.
The creme
nothing is more campy than. I mean, when I was first,
The Wiz is just funkier.
It's funkier. But when I was first kind of coming out and first like figuring out my stuff, I was part of like a queer scene in North Carolina, and people just quoted Wizard of Oz all the time. Like I had a gay friend who would just be like, "Oh, what a world, what a world." And that was just like his catchphrase. And like, you know, are you a good witch or a bad witch? It's like, there's nothing campier. And I feel like you could actually like play with that in a more self-conscious way if you wanted to. And, you know, I mean, I think you both might have read this. I wrote a Portal Fantasy novel like a dozen years or so ago, back when nobody wanted to.
Yeah, when we were in the writing group
And I feel like if I go back and ever revise it, I'm gonna just make it much more gay. Like that, I'll take that same story, but make it like 1,000% more gay, because I feel like that's what that story really needed.
Love it.
I think what I want to see, as we were talking about the issues around portal immigration and stuff, I kept thinking about Men in Black. And how that is a show that is about policing the portal, right? The whole thing is like, we got to keep these dirty aliens out and keep humanity from knowing about them. And so I want to see like a Men in Black, like a defund Men in Black kind of story, where they're reforming border cops basically, and like how do you change the idea of making that portal one way, or how do you start reimagining the relationship between people on either side of the portal. So I'd really love to see like kind of reverse Men in Black, like the diplomats who like, you know, help people come over or like lead people to the other world and say like, hey, these are the things you can do to not be a jerk while you're here eating lollipops made of flowers or whatever you're doing in the other world. So, or don't eat them because people will be offended, you know? So
that actually makes me wonder, because there's so many fantasies that are about magical creatures living among us, and those are like that metaphor for immigration. But are there any fantasies about like a bunch of people from our world like immigrating to a fantasy world and having like an immigration, like having a human town or whatever in like Wonderland or whatever? Like having that metaphor from the other side where we're the immigrants. Humans are the immigrants.
I don't know about the humans being immigrants to a fantasy world, but there's a couple of time travel fantasies where people from the future immigrate to the present or immigrate to the past, and there's all these issues around integrating them.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's that show, The Foreigners, where
and
it's like 3 different like cavemen and Vikings are showing up in modern day, and they're having to integrate all 3. And it follows like the first female Viking cop, I think, or something like that. I haven't watched it yet. So.
Female Viking cop is like basically my new band. What was that incredibly terrible show that was on about, I want to say like 10 years ago, where people from the future come and they're hidden in like Alaska and they're secretly controlling everything? Charlie Jane, you have to remember.
I feel like that's 5 different shows. I don't know.
Yeah, I was like,
anyway,
like 4400, like
right, it could be 40, it's not 4400, but like I feel like it had a really dumb name like The Happening or like The Changening, or anyway, whatever. it is what it is. The Groovening. Well, I think that's a good place to end. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for audience questions.
Let's end the episode and then do audience questions. So Naman, where can people find you online?
The best place to find me online is probably Twitter at Nomenism, which is NAAMENISM. I'm most active there. It's also Nomenism on Instagram. And those are probably the best places to find me.
And your books are available anywhere that fine books are sold.
Anywhere that fine and wonderful books are sold. If my books aren't there, they only sell trash.
Nice. Okay. Well, we'll do the outro later, I guess. So let's take some audience questions, right?
Okay, so I'm looking right now. So, I love this question. Somebody asked, do you have to have a portal on the page to count as portal fantasy? How literal does the portal have to be? I want to know what you guys think.
I think that's really up to like your perspective. I have a really wide perspective on portal fantasies. I think that anything where someone goes to a new reality, a new paradigm, can be considered a portal fantasy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, we didn't get a chance to talk about this in the episode, but Star Wars is definitely a portal fantasy. I think, we talked before about Guardians of the Galaxy being a portal. Come on, Luke Skywalker, he's a regular farm boy. He's sitting around on his farm, and then a wizard is like, "You're the chosen one."
No,
Luke.
I don't buy it. No, I don't.
You don't buy that
I
Star Wars
agree.
is a portal fantasy?
I agree that Guardians of the Galaxy is, because they don't know that there's this whole space world out there. But no, Star Wars is just it fits into the genre of like the kid who just wants to go off and have adventure. Like, then that means any quest story is like a portal fantasy.
I'm okay with that. Well, but also before we had talked about Jumanji. We had talked about Jumanji being a portal fantasy, and you had wanted. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but Jumanji totally, like the new version, the video game version.
Yeah. Charlie mentioned that you were talking about Jumanji as portal fantasy, Annalie, and I was like, that's fascinating, because when I saw it, I really compared it to like isekai anime, especially the ones where like people get sucked into a game and there are specific rules and specific lives.
Like Sword Art Online or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
But it fits
definitely
both,
like that.
really. It fits both in a really interesting way.
I mean, I would say that Sword Art Online is also
Oh yeah.
totally like a portal fantasy. I think I love that idea of like a portal fantasy with a weird portal. Like the movie Tron could also be a portal
Oh
fantasy.
yeah, no, it absolutely is.
I would absolutely
Or
consider that one.
Pleasantville, where they get sucked into the
Yeah.
TV. So I love that. So I think we've decided, other than Star Wars, which is clearly not a portal fantasy,
We're gonna fight about this later.
we're gonna fight totally.
Fight.
Okay, here's another question. What are your favorite underappreciated portal fantasies?
Well, I mentioned Palimpsest.
Yes.
I think is
Plus
very,
one.
very underappreciated. I love that one. I'm trying to think of what other underrated. It's also underrated by me.
Okay, Charlie Jane, do you have any? I'm trying to think of one too.
I'm trying to think of one.
I feel like we talked about a lot of them already.
Oh, if we're widening it a little bit and we're talking about TV, I would say the TV series Sliders.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
They literally go through a portal every episode to alternate worlds. And sometimes the alternate worlds don't make sense, but they're always delightful.
And it's very gay. Like, I don't know if there's any explicitly gay characters, but it's a very campy show. It's very silly.
I don't think there's any explicit queerness, but it's definitely like a queer.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, like Legends of Tomorrow is another good example.
I was going to say Legends of Tomorrow.
Super gay, lots of silly costumes. I mean, there's literally a subplot where like one of the characters gets his nipple bitten off by an evil unicorn, and then his nipple goes to hell. And when he gets his nipple back from hell, it's a haunted nipple. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I feel like that's such a gay subplot. I don't know why.
It is. Number one, you are absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
It comes after he basically implies that he did have sex with a man. Like right before his nipple gets bitten off, he's talking to John Constantine. And he's like, "Are you sure I'm certain and what we didn't count?" So I'm like, there's a lot of queer subjects there. I love that series.
I love how queer that show is, and that's just like.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't think of one right now, but I'll come back to you.
I think we named a lot in the episode, so I think you can just sort of say citation to a lot of what we talked about in the episode. Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions. So here's another great one. Portal fantasies give people the opportunity to explore aspects of their identity that they might not have completely figured out yet. What does it mean that portals serve as a sort of practice ground for identity? I love that.
Well, I think it's something you talked about, Annalie, a little bit, was the portal alibi.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to sort of explore these things in a non-confrontational, non-judgmental space, and then go back to your quote-unquote real life and have that be a completely separate part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of like, I went through the portal and learned a thing and grew up, and then, now I'm a better person or whatever, something like that.
It's like if you go on like a year abroad or whatever before college, or if you like travel, you go backpacking, you travel, or you go stay with your friends in the city, and like you get to try out being a different kind of version of yourself, and you get to like, nobody knows you, and you can just reinvent yourself. And it's sort of like that. It's like a coming of age kind of thing. It's like, if a lot of portal fantasies, even though we're kind of pushing the limits of that lately, a lot of portal fantasies are about young people who are figuring themselves out, and then they go through the portal, and then it's like they can, they get to try out different ways of being and see what works, and figure out who they actually really want to be when they grow up, kind of.
Yeah, I think Pan's Labyrinth is a really interesting example of that, because first of all, beautiful. It's
so good.
Guillermo del Toro is like a visual mastermind, but also, I mean, that's a story about a little girl during the rise of fascism in Spain, and her dad is part of the fascists, and she goes through this portal to escape her abusive dad. And it's a scary fairy world, and she does kind of grow up there, but part of her growing up is realizing that fascism is evil. And so it's not just kind of like, I grew up by learning that I could be strong. It's like I also learned something political while I was there. And I think that's like one of the things that makes that movie like a cut above in terms of portal fantasies for sure.
I think Guillermo del Toro really likes to play with portals and stuff like that in his work. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've seen the cartoon series on Netflix, Tales of Arcadia, which is
Mm-mm.
like 3 different linked portal fantasies linked together. The first one is like
Huh.
Troll Hunters, about a kid who is chosen to protect trolls and goes to the troll world. The second series is about 2 alien refugees who happen to land in the same city and are like fighting to take their homeland back. And the third series, which is coming out, I think next month, brings them all together and is a time portal with Merlin's assistant from Camelot being flung into the future and having to bring the trolls and the aliens and the wizards all together to fight an evil.
Oh
So
my God.
interesting mash of like
Wow.
3 different sort of like portal fantasies together.
Yeah. And again, playing with kind of national identity too.
Yeah.
And like, you know, like how do you bring together different cultures? I love that.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So let's see. Any other thoughts on that? Do we have any other questions? We have a couple more times. 2 minutes. Let's see.
Oh, She-Ra, the new She-Ra.
Yeah.
She-Ra, it's kind of a portal fantasy. I mean, they're
Is
already in the
it?
kind
I
of fantasy
have watched
world.
it all the way through.
I have watched it all the way through to the
Yeah.
important ending. But
I-
what's the portal?
I think
I mean,
that the whole planet was in a portal. The
yeah,
entire
it's in
planet
a
was
bubble universe,
It's in a
kind of.
pocket universe.
It's in a pocket universe.
I would argue that it goes because once that happens, once the wider universe is explored, again, a wider universe they didn't know existed, like Guardians of the
Okay.
Galaxy.
Okay.
It also shifts genres a little bit. It goes from like fantasy with a bit of science fiction to a space opera feel because you sort of merge into this wider world, and all of a sudden there's spaceships and it's interplanetary, as opposed to like the first 3 seasons where you're like, it's just on this tiny world. That's all we know.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of the arc of Steven Universe a little bit too. Like it starts out as like, we're just like magical people and it's a magical boy. And then, I mean, it moves much more quickly into space opera, but it's that same kind of arc where it's like you think you're in a sort of cozy little magic family. And then it's like actually interplanetary warfare. Yes, Charlie Jane.
I want to mention a very important portal fantasy that people never, ever talk about when they talk about portal fantasy. It is Planet Hulk.
Hey, I was thinking about Planet Hulk. Yeah. I mean, that's
Planet
one of my
Hulk.
favorite.
Planet Hulk. When y'all were talking about
adventures.
spaceships and stuff, that I was thinking Planet fucking Hulk. Have you read it, Naman?
I have. I'm actually a huge fan of Planet Hulk and have a lot of hatred towards the people who sent Hulk, the Illuminati. I don't like them. Never liked
those guys. Screw those guys.
But yeah, no, that was actually it was actually a portal fantasy with a consequence. Because when he came back, it was World War Hulk, and it was a very sort of justified scenario where you were like, well, I can't be that mad at him for revenge.
No, it was almost like they sent him to a reserve. You know what I mean? They were like, okay, you can't be here on Earth. We're going to send you to a reserve, and which is neglected and has all these economic problems. And then he comes back to Earth really pissed off. But also just that planet where he gets to be like a hero as himself and like have a badass punching tough queen, where she's like, yeah, I'm as tough as you, no problem. And everybody has
the old Kyra, the old strong.
Yeah. I like any world with lots of exoskeletons. So I don't know if that's
like my favorite Hulk story, which is saying a lot.
Yeah, I'm very Hulk identified. So it's definitely, it's up there.
I love Hulk, and I love that story. I feel like comics that introduce like kids of characters or like brothers or stuff like that get a really bad rap. Like when they introduced Wonder Woman's long lost twin brother, and it was like no one likes him, and then he turned queer and everyone liked him. But
I forgot.
It always makes you better.
Forgot about
All right.
that.
On that note, we're going to wind up. Just remember, becoming queer makes you better.
Yeah.
That's today's
For
lesson
sure.
from
That is
our
always a good
opinions are
lesson.
correct.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Naman. You were the greatest. It was so good to
Yes.
hang out with you. I miss you so much.
Oh, I miss
We'll
you guys
have to
too.
hang out
Thanks for
online
having me.
again
Yeah,
soon.
we all used to
And
be in a writing group together in a cafe back in the day.
back in the day. Thank
Back
you
in
for
the
All
having
right.
us at the
world.
OutWrite Festival. Thank you, Marianne and Dave. Thanks, everybody. You're
Guys.
all the best.
Thanks to
And
OutWrite. Have a great rest of the weekend, you
bye.
guys.